Right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me to be here today. It's a pleasure. Sadly, I'm not going to be talking about European cuisine today, although that would probably be more interesting, but I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the work that's happening in the UK around real-world evidence, specifically the work we're doing at NICE around developments so that we're producing evidence based on the best fit for practice, fit for purpose evidence. And I'll also touch on some of the project work that we're engaged with in Europe and some of the stakeholder engagement we're involved in as well. So, NICE is a HTA body, so that means it's a health technology assessor. So, essentially, our key function here when it comes to assessment of drugs is to understand the comparative effectiveness and comparative cost effectiveness of new treatments compared with standard practice. And to do that, we need good data, of course. That's obvious. And the key challenge here is that the availability of relevant, good quality data is increasingly becoming scarce. So we're seeing some challenges mounting up in this space, and the audience will be well aware of what the key challenges might be, but just to name a few. So, new treatments in orphan disease areas, for instance, are becoming available, and these are not supported by the large clinical trials that we're so used to seeing in our assessments. Drugs are getting marketing authorization based on a single-arm trial, for instance, in orphan disease areas or areas of great unmet need. And this is a challenge because we haven't got the comparative evidence because of the lack of the head-to-head trial data for effectiveness. And clearly, there's an urgent need to get treatments to patients quicker. We're seeing some drugs being accelerated through different regulatory mechanisms, both in the US and in Europe. For instance, in the adaptive pathways mechanism in Europe. And this means that not only are we getting data and drugs to patients quicker, but we're getting less mature data and greater reliance on observational data than ever before. And we don't know quite to deal with that situation. So all this combined means that there's increased uncertainty around the decision that we have to make as a decision maker. And this is challenging really the framework, the decision framework that NICE has as an HTA body, a framework that to a great extent relies on randomized controlled trial data and not other types of data. So we're in a new world here. But also, as an assessment body, NICE and other assessment bodies in Europe are increasingly realizing that real-world evidence does have a role here. Randomized controlled trials do not always provide the most suitable data for our assessment and for the decisions that we need to make for how drugs perform in real practice. So now, some of these issues are, for instance, narrow inclusion criteria in trials, which means that we don't know how effective a drug is in patients in complex and multiple comorbidity situations or in patients with more severe disease, because these patients are simply not recruited to the trials, so therefore we haven't got information. And neither do time-limited trials give us the information that we need around long-term effectiveness in patients with chronic diseases, for instance. And I also mentioned the interest in comparative effectiveness. We're often getting trials with comparators that don't reflect our local practice or clinical practice, and therefore we can't make the comparative effectiveness. And because of all this, we're realizing that real-world evidence does have a role here in trying to support the information and where we're heading. But clearly, there are issues around robustness and study designs, and there's limited acceptance in Europe around this. So some of the issues, I don't need to tell you that the situation in Europe is really fragmented. So the landscape, this is just an example from a publication that was done 2 years ago, but I still think the observation holds today. And it shows that the situation is fragmented when it comes to methods that HTAs apply in practice. It also shows that the acceptability and usefulness of real-world evidence varies in decision-making. And there are a number of reasons for this. So on the right-hand side, you see some conclusions arising from a review of real-world data and policies in Europe. So there are limited availability of data at the time of assessment, potential for bias, poor quality data, or data sources are not established for the research purposes. So this clearly has an implication when it comes to downstream analysis. So to try and tackle this, the IMI GetReal project was set up about 4 years ago. So the project finished a year ago, and the project was funded by the IMI, the Innovative Medicines Initiative in Europe. So IMI is the largest public-private partnership in the healthcare science sector worldwide. And in this particular instance, IMI brought together various partners, so a large number of stakeholders, regulators, HTA bodies, payers, patients, clinicians, pharma companies, all brought together to explore how real-world evidence could be used to help support evidence generation strategies, and looking at how useful these evidence might be and these data might be to key decision makers such as the regulators and the HTA bodies. So the project did various things, and it explored how real-world evidence could address situations where we have expensive long trials. As we know, this is an issue that in the end provide information that isn't necessarily fit for purpose, so clearly are not a good situation to be in. I'm not going to go into detail around what the project produced, but you can go on the website shown there and look at the outputs. There's various methods, development reports, and educational material that is available on the website. So, the unique nature of this project, which is to bring together experts from diverse backgrounds and organizations, helped generate some important learnings and also helped us summarize and synthesize research recommendations and policy recommendations that the consortium felt was important to look at to develop the dialogue and move things forward. Because we can only do so much in terms of talking. We need to move things into actions. So we identified several gaps in the situation at the moment, and this was a year ago, and thankfully some of those gaps are already being addressed, for instance, by the work that's being done here today. Some of it's related to the reliability of data and the robustness of study designs to answer some of the important questions that we need answering. And some of these key topics are shown here, and it's good to see, as I say, that we're already addressing some of these topics. But this highlights that we're still on a journey. We're on a journey to understand how best to use real-world data, and it highlights that primarily education and guidance is required to help us go through this. And what is clear is that we need to focus on the whole journey. So the whole journey ranging from designing the studies to implementing the studies, or actually the execution of data collection, through to the synthesis, the analysis, and subsequently the study designs. We need to address all these points in order to progress. So I'm pleased to say that we've now received funding for a 2-year extension of the GetReal project to create a sustainable body to take forward the work that we did in the previous project, and essentially to create a self-funded entity that we hope can continue the journey forward. Again, the uniqueness of the group that comes together in this situation, and similar to the previous one, it is that it's a public-private partnership, bringing together payers, regulators, clinicians, pharma companies, etc., to create an environment where all voices are heard, so that the solutions that we're developing are fit for purpose for all decision makers and all stakeholders in this area. So some of the activities that the new initiative is looking at is setting up engagement with the research community, continuing what we did in the past, setting up a think tank that takes forward some of the agenda and does a bit of brainstorming and heavy lifting and thinking. We're setting up task forces to look at individual aspects of methods development, continuing to maintain some tools that we developed, and hopefully develop more tools that helps with both the analysis and the decision making, and also clearly continue with education and dissemination. And the self-funding entity will continue to drive the dialogue, such as the dialogue we're having today with you guys, continue to develop the tools and the education that we feel so strongly is required. So the vision for the think tank that I mentioned is going to be set up is that it will consist of international thought leaders. It will discuss, assess and give recommendations on the opportunities and barriers to the generation, use and acceptability of real-world evidence. And really they will act as ambassadors for the use of real-world evidence during the project and beyond the project, engaging with key stakeholder groups to drive policy debate and to facilitate the uptake of the previous project. And we're really hoping that the think tank will engage as broadly as possible. And I think there will be opportunities to engage with many of you who are here today going forward on this journey with the think tank. Because we would rather sort of complement the work that's being done elsewhere rather than compete. And I think there's clear synergies in the work that the new GetReal think tank will be doing and the framework and the work that's being developed here. So this was briefly the GetReal project. So you might well ask, how has this work that we've been involved in the last 2 years, 3 years, 4 years been influential, and has it actually impacted on the way NICE works over in the UK? So I'm going to show you 3 brief examples of where this is the case. But firstly, just to highlight that NICE has a broad remit and many functions. So just to highlight that we're not the regulators and we're not payers, we sit somewhere in between, and we provide guidance to a broad range of stakeholders, so health, public health and social care. And I think most people will be aware of the guidance that we produce on new drugs through the technology appraisals program shown on the right-hand side on new medicines. But we also have a broad function in terms of providing guidelines in health and public health and social care. Clearly, this broad remit means that we have different challenges, both in terms of approach that can be taken and the data that's available. You can imagine the data in the social care sector is completely different to the data that might be available for a drug or in the clinical area. So therefore, the approach that we will take up in relation to real-world evidence at NICE has to be compatible across all these different areas with all the different needs. And if it isn't compatible, we need to be able to explain why that is not the case. So, the first example of how NICE is progressing. So, we're looking at future cross-NICE capabilities, and we're setting up a healthcare and data analytics team internally, which has a remit across not just drugs, but also the health and social care space. So this data team is an in-house team that will help identify research questions and work with data owners, analyze data clearly as and when required as part of guidance production, and provide quality assurance of data, and develop with the external community approach to actually implementing real-world evidence in health and social care guidelines. This has to be supported and supplemented by an external advisory group, which consists of members, data owners, experts, and real-life science industry that is then going to help NICE understand where we need to develop our guidance, where we need to help us support access to data, and provide direction on methods and evidence synthesis. And in some cases, we might want to develop a more formal relationship through partnership arrangements. And this includes, for instance, engagement with the National Health Services around facilitating access to data and understanding how our guidance is impacting on the healthcare system. It could include working with academia, for instance, to understand how we can develop and get expertise in terms of methods. And clearly work with national health policy agencies to help support capacity and capabilities within NICE, and also help us implement some pilot projects. Next example, in terms of how we're actually incorporating learnings from GetReal, is in the methods guide for health and social care. So this, just to be clear, this is not the guide around the assessment of drugs. That's a separate guide that will be updated shortly, and we'll consider how we can implement directional real-world evidence in that particular guide. But we're here describing the range of possible situations in which real-world data can be used in the context of these guidelines. It's more meant to be informative than exhaustive, and to stimulate and encourage guideline developers to look at real-world data. And it just flags key areas where we think there is a role potentially for real-world data, for instance, to address the efficacy-effectiveness gap, to demonstrate comparative effectiveness, as I mentioned, to extrapolate treatment beyond the duration of clinical trials, and to understand the impact of bringing treatments to patients and the impact on the healthcare system. So clearly just a little bit of eye-opener for guidance developers here. And lastly, focus on methods development. So my team, we're working quite broadly with funders in the UK. We've provided highlight notice. The MRC provided highlight notice in collaboration with us, looking at attracting interest in methods development relating to how HTA bodies can make their decisions based on real-world data. And we've funded 2 projects already in this space. We're also engaging directly in projects in various areas here, for instance, how to adjust for biases, look at outcome definitions in big data and real data, because there are some opportunities here, and also how we can use big data generally in guidelines development and healthcare decision making. So on that note, just to highlight that NICE has been around for 20 years now, next year, and we're mindful that we are dealing with different situation than we were 20 years ago, and we need to be able to move forward and work and develop a method such that we can deal with the future and the data availability and the situations in the healthcare system. So therefore, just a reminder to myself and everyone else that we can't just sit still, we need to develop further forward. Thank you. Got time for questions or? Okay.
Yeah, so I got to get any legs, so I'm not going to go to the microphone, but I noticed that. All right, well, give up to the microphone. I noticed in your slides that you drew a distinction between real-world evidence and randomization. It's something that we've talked a lot about, and just to remind everybody. In 21st century cures, they locked the doors and kept the FDA out the last 48 hours. And there was an error in the law compared to what was intended that made that distinction. And we've gotten it, it's been changed in the user fee negotiations to change the law, at least in the US, where randomization is considered part of real world evidence if it's done in the real world. I'm wondering what's happening in NICE with this regard.
That's right. We're really interested in more pragmatic trial designs that include randomizations, and likewise we consider that part of the whole spectrum of real-world data, if you like, just with a more pragmatic approach. That's right.